As Jen said, I'm Ellen Shapiro. I've been working on the iOS SDK at Apollo for the last year and a half. And I want to go around and have our panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to have you go in the order that you're showing up on the stream. So Martin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, Ellen. Hello, everyone. My name is Martin. I'm joining from Paris, France. I've been doing Kotlin and GraphQL since 2016, 17 maybe. And I loved it. Started contributing Apollo Android and work full-time on Apollo Android since last year.
Cool. Ivan.
My name is Ivan, and I'm from Canada, working at Shopify, and I'm a main contributor to the Apollo Android. And at Shopify, we are heavily using the GraphQL, all our REST API deprecated.
Cool. And Hisham.
Hey, everybody. I'm Hisham. I'm joining y'all from Brooklyn, New York. And I have been working on GitHub Mobile since, well, basically day one in mid-2019.
Cool. Did you work on what was it, GitHawk before that at all? Or nice, yeah. GitHawk was sort of the predecessor that also used the Apollo client to interact with the GitHub API. So yeah, I wanted to have us start out. We're going to be taking questions from the Twitch stream. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and throw them in there. There's already one in there, which is Lauren is curious if we have a sense of GraphQL market penetration into mobile dev versus website dev. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and throw that to Martin.
Good question. I don't know. I don't have any specific numbers. I feel like once you start doing GraphQL, you do it for all your front-end apps, regardless of whether it's web or mobile. So I can talk a bit about my previous company, which was a video streaming company, and they decided to split their PHP monolith into GraphQL microservices. And obviously, once you start doing that, I mean, maybe you start with web, but that often means mobile is following up closely. Or at least this was my experience.
Yeah. Hesh, what's your experience been with that at GitHub?
Well, for us, anytime that we can use a GraphQL API instead of REST, we greatly prefer it. Because it's just a lot less overhead for us, right? Like we don't have to write all this parsing code. We don't have to duplicate all of this web model code. And so just basically being able to say, these are the bits that I need and this is what I want to, showcase in the mobile app has been a huge game changer for us.
Nice. Ivan, how about at Shopify? Have you seen like a difference in adoption between the website and the mobile side?
To be honest, we are completely moved to GraphQL, and the adoption of REST is downgrading, and everything is moving to GraphQL. We prefer the GraphQL first, and it's very hard to sell why you need still use the REST API. So everyone is moving to GraphQL.
Yeah. We got a good question from Polly, which is, what is your thought process around a persistence layer? Do you find yourself using SQL, NoSQL, Graph, and why? And I think this is a good time. We sort of had talked a little bit about potentially discussing why is caching in GraphQL kind of complicated. So I want to let let's say Martin, I think you're probably in the best position since you've been banging your head against this on the Android side for the last little bit.
Yeah, and also I am biased because I spend so much time with this normalized cache that I feel like it solves a lot of issues, but maybe it doesn't solve all the issues. It's kind of neat because I don't want to go too much into the details of normalization, and because I think this would take us very far. But a normalized cache is basically a way to take your object and flatten them so that you can store your entities only once and flatten your graph. And this allows some nice use cases, such as building a completely reactive store that as soon as you modify something in your cache, will update your UI. So it has a lot of goodies and nice things you can do with it. It also comes with some more things you have to configure. Yeah, and defining IDs and stuff. Like there's a lot of stuff we want to do to improve the situation, but there is some setup to do. So sometimes it might be easier to just take your entities and map them to a standard ORM that you would store in a regular SQL database. So both approaches are valid, I think.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've seen on the iOS side is that I think you're correct. One of the big question marks is sort of how do you identify something? Do you identify it only by an ID, or is it a combination of the ID and the type name? Is it something where even those are not sufficient to allow you to completely identify something? And there are also places where you may want to have specific pieces of data that are like, well, this only really exists in relation to this other piece of data. So there's a lot of fun stuff in there, but I think we've generally tried to have the normalized cache available in multiple formats. I know on iOS we have it both in memory and SQLite. I believe that's also the case on Android. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah, and so it's definitely something where I think one of the biggest questions about caching stuff is just sort of like, are you trying to do a normalized cache, or where you're able to sort of hit it and see what pieces have already been fetched? Or are you trying to do something more akin to the type of cache that you would build out if you were using REST, where you just have all the pieces of data downloaded no matter what? So that's a bit of an open question. This is a good question as well. What has been your time of support of fields with mobile app versions? Websites can always update to the latest, but mobile apps ship with old versions of queries. Hesham, I'm going to throw that one to you, since I know you all have had some interesting things happening with that.
Yeah. So in general, for the app that actually interacts with GitHub.com, we try not to really deprecate a whole lot. Like we'll mark something as deprecated, and we'll just gradually move on to the new query, to the new mutation. But in general, we don't really kill things too much. We just kind of like let the usage drop down to just about zero, and at that point we feel pretty comfortable getting rid of that public API. Another aspect of this is that we also support enterprise. And enterprise ships, is a server that ships with an old schema, but we continue to update the app using the existing schema, and that has been a bit more challenging because we're now trying to normalize over multiple schemas.
Yeah, that sounds kind of like a nightmare. I think another related question is how do you make sure that the schema that's packaged in Android and iOS apps are valid all the time in terms of breaking changes, type and field deprecations, especially in Federation world? Ivan, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, we have this similar as in GitHub. So we usually try to not break things and like to not remove something that is there. And we have there are like different policies, but I think that on our end, it's like 6 months policy. So if you really want to remove, first you mark it as deprecated and then let like 6 months to still be there. And after that, only remove. Also, we have like versioning as well. Like, yeah, I know that like one selling point for GraphQL, you don't need to have a versioning, but you still do in some cases, especially like when you introduce some new queries and maybe slightly change the behavior. So in one of our public API GraphQL schema, we have a version as well. And other than that, like we just try to always keep our schema in sync and regenerate the models. But again, because schema is not changing, not breaking changes, so we're expecting the same like models for at least 6 months. But obviously, we will update sooner.
What tooling are you using? So first we'll go to Ivan since he was just talking, but I'm interested in what tooling you're using to make sure that you're not breaking the schema. So what are you using at Shopify?
We have a bunch of the integration tests, so we are relying on that. And I don't think that we have any other tooling to like track the changes. And obviously, because we have all this deprecation cycle, so we are not expecting to break a lot of things right away.
Okay. Yeah. Hisham, how about you guys?
So we very similarly, we just try not to break things, but at the same time, we largely generate our project files. Like we use Xcode Gen and like a series of rake file functions to basically generate our project, but also keep our schema in sync.
Cool. And like when you say keep your schema in sync, you're like basically like, does the backend use any particular tooling to sort of say this is the canonical version of the schema?
No, I mean specifically just to make sure that basically anytime that you are generating the project, that you are getting the schema, the updated schema from the backend. So we're basically always running off of the most recent schema in development, and by basically making heavy use of deprecations and having a very slow deprecation cycle, we're able to kind of get around breaking things.
Yeah, that sounds cool. One thing that's come up a couple of times, people are asking about various different backends and what people prefer to work with. Is there anything that you've found where the backend even really matters on the mobile side, or is it more just sort of like the GraphQL schema is the interface? And the language or anything of the schema or of whatever is producing the schema is somewhat less relevant.
Personally, I find that the actual backend doesn't really matter a whole lot, because I don't think about the backend. I think about the schema. That's how I'm interacting with the backend. So the backend could be like a Node backend. It could be TypeScript. It could be Ruby. It could be Rails. It could be Django. It doesn't really matter a whole lot to me, because the way that I interface with it is through the schema.
Cool.
I'd love to think that using a backend like Kotlin would make a lot of fields not nullable, because this is one of my frustration with GraphQL is that fields are nullable by default, and you have to add this exclamation mark. But I'm not super familiar enough with the backend to know if that would translate into the schema directly.
I think that the very important to that, like if backend follows exactly specification of GraphQL, it doesn't matter what kind of backend. I remember like we saw in early stages of our Apollo Android client, we saw some like interesting question around like particular backend, but all these tickets were basically the same reason, like the server didn't follow the exact specification, slightly did some different way. So, but after like recently, we didn't receive any tickets related to like something different.
Yeah. I think people are much more coming together on the spec. This is a really good question. What are the biggest GraphQL caveats my team should be aware of as we create our first mobile app? We already completely rely on GraphQL API to power our website. So let's say, Hisham, I think this could be a good one for you, because that is basically what was happening at GitHub. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So the big challenges, I think, are largely a shift in mindset for mobile engineers. You aren't thinking in terms of endpoints. You're thinking in terms of data. You're thinking in terms of what do I need to power my views, or what data do I need to change to make the change on the back end. So you aren't thinking in terms of like, well, I have to call this endpoint and this endpoint does something. You're now thinking, I am the actor and I am basically, deciding what happens as the client. And it's kind of empowering, and it's a little scary, and it's a little different, but I find that that's usually the big hurdle.
Cool. Martin, can you talk a little bit about that experience at your previous gig?
Yeah, well, it went pretty well, I would say. I mean, it's an easy sell because there's a lot of tooling, and all the mobile developers were on board pretty much from day one. And I don't know, like having some stuff like GraphQL where you can interactively type your queries and have the documentation, like the simple fact that you have the documentation available all the time and you don't have to ask someone in your backend team or like ask for a new field, or you can just query whatever you want. I think the transition was really smooth, and I think I don't want to sound too optimistic, but I think it was faster, like to just use GraphQL than what it would have taken using REST. I'm pretty sure if you ask the same question to one of the backend engineers, the question might be different because they have to handle scaling, caching on their side, and this kind of stuff. But on the mobile side, I mean, it was really a smooth process.
Yeah, I think one thing that I definitely agree with saying GraphQL and also Apollo Studio are like really, really helpful for starting to understand how GraphQL works, because you are able to really quickly edit and change the queries and see the changes in the responses. So you can see how changes to your query affect the response and how that's going to eventually be sort of ingested into your application. So I think that for me was super huge when I was really first like wrapping my head around most of GraphQL, just because otherwise it can be pretty difficult. So yeah, let's see. I think, let's see. There was one question that does let me share one interesting piece of knowledge. It said, Ellen, with you moving into a new role within Apollo, excuse me if I'm mistaken, you are not mistaken. Can we expect all of the exciting plans for Apollo iOS to continue as planned and on schedule? Really excited about these. On schedule is an interesting idea, but I am happy to share that we are hiring another iOS developer. We've got Anthony Miller, who is already here working his tail off on the code generation stuff. He's really up to his eyeballs at all of that right now. But we're hiring another iOS developer. We're also hiring another Android developer. Martin, do you want to talk a little bit about that position?
Well, there's a lot of stuff to do. So please come join us to work on Apollo Android. Yeah, we're working hard on a new major version for Apollo Android. That would be Kotlin first and Kotlin multi-platform first. So exposing idiomatic flows for APIs. As I told earlier, there's a lot of stuff to be done on the caching side as well. Stuff like pagination that could be easier to handle, the normalized cache, streamline all the configuration. I'm dreaming of more tooling also to investigate the cache. But plenty of stuff to do. So if you're excited about GraphQL, Kotlin, multi-platform, all this kind of stuff, please apply. I don't know, we can put the link in the chat somewhere, or it's in Twitter. It's everywhere.
Yeah, apollographql.com/careers. So I want to go back to more questions on the mobile side. One good question is, how do you do error handling? Do you parse the errors field in the front end app, or do you prefer having the errors as part of a schema? So Ivan, how do you prefer that?
Well, we have there are different errors, right? You can have developer errors, and they usually comes into regarding the specification. There is a section where you provide if GraphQL execution failed, and do some syntax errors, so it will deliver there. So it's more developer error, but there is a user error, and we usually provide the GraphQL additional field. So if you perform, let's say, mutation, and mutation can fail due to some logical business logic errors. So we also provide, you can request what kind of error this mutation running into, and you can also specify what fields. Maybe you just listen for the code, you don't need explanation, don't need the message. So yeah, we part of the schema usually do that.
Cool. Hashem, how about you?
So we take a slightly different approach. We basically, so our app is more or less optimistic. Everything that you do gets optimistically updated on the UI. So while you're seeing the change, the GraphQL query is firing, and if something goes wrong, we basically display a toast with either like a human readable, like we personally wrote the error message kind of message, if it's something that we expected, or we basically just show the server's error text in that toast if it's something unexpected, and we basically roll back any changes that you may have made that we displayed optimistically.
Yeah, I think I've seen a few places that are using sort of custom defined errors for like very specific errors. But for the most part, like it's really helpful to have the GraphQL errors be really flexible, just because there are so many things that could possibly go wrong. And having that, particularly on mobile, where it would it need to be parsed into a more static type, can really limit you in terms of what information you can get and what information you can expose to the user. So it's definitely worth thinking about. It is something where I have seen a couple of places where if there's something really, really specific that people want to be able to handle, they do have their own specific type for it, but not really as much as just using the more dynamic stuff within errors. Speaking of stat, go ahead.
This is actually a place where having nullable fields is useful, because you can fall back to null fields when you have an error in a part of your GraphQL tree, and then display partial data. So I know some companies do that, and so this means you don't lose all of your data. You can still display some stuff. So nullability isn't always bad.
Yeah, it's definitely something where the ability to sort of show whatever data succeeded versus just like, sorry, nothing worked, is definitely helpful. I want to talk a little bit about static versus dynamic, just because in our code gen tooling, we do a lot of generation of static types. So on iOS, we are generating static Swift code. On Android, we're generating static Kotlin code. And are you guys still you're doing some Java code at this point? Is that correct? Yep. Is that still going to be happening in version 3? Because I know
not at the beginning. We're having this whole new code gen to write fragments as interfaces. That comes with a lot of, we had to rewrite a lot of stuff. So this will be Kotlin first, and we might bring Java alongside, but this will come in a later step.
Yeah. I think the ironic thing about y'all doing fragments as interfaces is I had sort of initially started talking about doing fragments as protocols for Swift. And we wound up digging far enough into that and realizing that there's some issues in Swift's handling of generics that mean that we actually can't do fragments as protocols. And then y'all kept going on Android, and it was like, oh no, Android actually has this like more advanced handling of generics and in out and all that kind of stuff. So sorry I did that to you. But it is something where I think there's going to be some really neat features coming out of that. And let's see. I know that Hashem, how have you guys at GitHub really sort of liked working with those static types?
So we really enjoy working with the static types. By and large, we try to wrap them or in a sense with our own types where applicable, just because our philosophy is that we basically treat the data that comes in almost like a view model. It powers a view. The stuff that we get in, it goes basically directly in a view, sometimes with minimal processing. And where we need to like make extensions for like tint colors or icons or whatever, it feels a little bit funny to do it on the statically generated type. So we'll, wrap it and encase it and show it off there.
Cool. Ivan, what have you seen that's been both helpful and not helpful? Like, has there been anything that you've run up against that's sort of like a harder problem with the types?
Not really a hard problem, but obviously like strictly type languages are less flexible. And so you kind of lock on the type system, on the types that is generated. And sometimes like you cannot express through the GraphQL query like what you really want, and you stuck with the generated models, and maybe those generated models are not enough for you. So we usually prefer like leave generated models on the network layer and do not actually leak the network models into the UI, because all the time, or maybe not all the time, but it's often happens when you're missing something in that model, and then you try to wrap that into something else and to add additional UI, some field, etc. So we just like, okay, the network model shouldn't never leak to the UI presentation, and we just like, a bunch of mapping. So it's annoying to write mapping to one layer to another, but it gives you some flexibility.
I think that's considerably more common on Android in terms of sort of making sure that the sort of there's the networking models and then there's the models that are displayed to the user. Having those be basically totally separate, I think, is kind of a legacy of the Java influence on Android stuff, just because the clean architecture was such a thing with Java, so we've only got a couple of minutes left. I did want to allow for an amusing little chat that someone suggested, which is, say, Martin and Ivan, let's talk about what happened with JCenter. Who wants to explain what happened, and who wants to talk about what a disaster that was?
Well, yeah, but it's all good now, so it's all behind, which is good. I think ultimately it was for the greater good, but we at Apollo Android released all our artifacts to GCenter like until I want to say version 2.2 or something like this, which means we had maybe, I don't know, 20 or 30 versions available only on GCenter. And GCenter and Bintray, the company behind GCenter, decided to stop hosting artifacts at the beginning of the year. It was in February or March, something like this. And they give a very short notice period. So everybody had like something like 30 days to move their publication to somewhere else. So this kept a lot of Android developers very busy earlier this year.
They did eventually sort of relent a little bit and say, okay, like you can read stuff for a little bit longer, but you can't upload anything new after that 30-day period. But yeah, so we're all moved over to Maven Central now on Android. Is that correct?
Yep, that's done. Yes.
Fun. Yeah, I've definitely had a couple of things where I've had to like republish tags on a bunch of things, and it's just like, this is my favorite part of this job. But yeah, it's fun stuff. Well, I think we're just about done. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation. If you have any more questions, just pop them in the Twitch chat, and we'll try to answer them in there. And I hope everybody had a good time.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.